Welcome. We're honored to have you listen and participate in these dialogues produced by the Cora de Brautzau Foundation. To learn more about the Foundation and about how you can help us in our mission of unearthing untold stories of moral energy, please visit us at virtuesofpeace.com. There you can access show archives, show resources, visit our Etsy shop, and support us with a donation. virtuesofpeace.com.
Hello and welcome to Virtues of Peace. My name is Hope Elizabeth May, and I'm joined by Michael Buzzy, Randy Olson, and Riley Olson. And we are back talking about Bertha von Suttner's Lay Down Your Arms. This is part 2 of a mini-series that we are doing on Bertha von Suttner's most famous book, Lay Down Your Arms, which caused her to win the Nobel Peace Prize in large part. Lay Down Your Arms is a work of 435 pages. Last week, or I should say the last time we discussed this book, which was on September 16th, we just discussed the first 3 chapters. So today we hope to get up to chapter 6. We will likely just be focused on chapters 4 and 5. And so you can download the text at our show resources page, virtuesofpeace.com. Chapters 4 through 5 are pages 59 to 115. And I also wanted to add that the show resources from last week contain, of course, the entire text, but also this article that we discussed last week by Bertha von Suttner called How I Wrote Lay Down Your Arms. And so that's a really great introduction, gives you some context to the book. And we again discussed that last week. But today we're picking up with chapter 4, and just to sort of review where we left off. Really, last week's show was about this evolution and transformation of Martha. So again, the subtitle of Lay Down Your Arms is the autobiography of Martha von Tilling. And that von Tilling name is the name of her second husband, who we will continue talking about today. But Martha begins her life as Martha Althaus and then becomes a Martha Dotzky. And we discussed last week how she learns that her first husband has died. He's gone to battle and he has died. And the very first chapter of Lay Down Your Arms, what you're really seeing in these first 3 chapters is this evolution of this like really immature character. So if you look at the text, in the table of contents, Girlish Days begins the first chapter summary. And the first sentence of the book that we discussed last time, at 17, I was a thoroughly overwrought creature. So she's very emotional. She does begin to think about war, but she still has this sort of received view. Her father is a general. She marries a soldier and he dies. And the end of chapter 3 is this Baron Friedrich von Tilling explaining to Martha how he died. And Riley sort of focused on one of the passages at the end of chapter 3 about the way that Friedrich von Tilling is describing it starts to reveal that there's something different about him. He's a soldier, but he's a different kind of soldier. And so what you're going to see in these chapters 4 through 5 is really the learning of Martha about the true character of this soldier. So he looks like a soldier, he is a soldier, but there's something else going on and he's very different. And so I'll just turn it over to you, Riley. the sort of subheadings of chapter 4, just to give us a big frame, is progress of my friendship for Tilling, his mother's death, and growth of love. And so, Riley, over to you.
Right. So, one of the first things that happens in this chapter is Martha's father has a dinner at his house, and there are some generals and Dr. Bresser and Baron von Tilling, Frederick. And so during this dinner, they're discussing Darwin's book, which we had briefly mentioned last time. And one of the generals, or Dr. Bresser, brings it up, and they are all expressing very strong opinions on it, whether his theory of evolution is correct or incorrect. And they're all having this argument, basically throwing things back and forth, but most of them are on the side of like, oh, the theory is definitely incorrect. And so then one of them asks Freidrich Tilling if, like, what he thinks about it. And so on page 69, Tilling says, I will make no assertion at all about it, because, as I said, I do not know the book, but I will make a point of reading it. Perhaps, but only perhaps, for my knowledge of such matters is only slight, I shall then be able to form a judgment. Up to the present time, I must confine myself to supporting my opinion on the fact that this theory meets with widespread and passionate opposition. A fact, to be sure, which, to my mind, speaks rather for than against its truth. And this is, in Martha's view, like very admirable of him to say, just refusing to make an opinion on it because he hasn't read the actual text itself. He refuses to go based off of, hearsay and what others are saying about it. And after he says this, every single person who's been having this conversation admits that they haven't read it either. And so Martha, who's been silent for basically this whole conversation about Darwin, is the only one who's read the book. And so this reveals more of Tilling's character to Martha. And I think it's also something that, today we can all learn from, because we often find ourselves in conversations about different issues where everyone has really strong opinions about it, but doesn't actually know anything about whatever the issue is. Yeah. Hope, did you have something to say?
Yes, I mean, I'll begin. I'm sure others have something to say as well, but yes, I think you're reading this passage on page 69, and just to remind people, The Origin of Species is published in 1859, and this book, Lay Down Your Arms, is published in 1889. So that's 30 years. And so, yeah, it's kind of like the new theory, Darwin's theory. And I also wanted to just the passage that you read, like sort of right above it. So it's really like page 68, where they've said, okay, I've heard a good deal about this, but I've not read it. And I must confess, said the doctor, I have not either. I have not either. Like, so everybody, confesses they have not read it. And then this minister, and not a sort of, I think it's like a foreign minister, not a religious minister, but the minister proceeded, quote, the subject has been so much spoken of. The cant words of the system, quote, fight for existence, natural selection, evolution, etc., are in everybody's mouth, so that one can form a clear conception of the whole matter and select a side decidedly with its supporters or opponents. So in other words, like unquote, it goes on, but hey, like these concepts are out there and you don't really like need to read the book. This is what the argument is. And so you can pick a side. And then Tilling says that can hardly be positively asserted unless one knows the position of its supporters in order to know what the strength of the opposing arguments is, which, as soon as a new idea comes up, are heard shouting in chorus all around it. One must have penetrated into the idea. I love that. And then he goes on to say, this is Tilling, it is generally the worst and weakest reasons which are repeated by the masses with such unanimity and on such grounds I do not choose to pass a judgment. And here it comes. When the theory of Copernicus came up, only those who had gone through the labor of following the calculations of Copernicus could see that they were correct. The others who guided their judgment by the anathemas which were thundered against the new system from Rome. And so he goes on to say that, like, it wasn't just the masses who disagreed with Copernicus, it was the scientists themselves. And he has this, the old fogies of science. And I just think that this passage, like, in addition to you have to read the book, you have to go through the labor. And this goes back to what we talked about last time, the first installment of, like, you have to read it again, go through the calculations, go through the mental activity. And there it is. That's all I have to say.
I mean, I can share that sentiment, and I have a story that I experienced that's very much relevant to this. And I think that this model is true of most political conversations. But when I was, early in my 20s, I had the luxury, I suppose, of attending a event, and I ended up getting sat next to a person who was very anti-abortion, which we don't have to talk about the issue so much as I remember feeling very confident that this person was a silly person because I had a different attitude towards that social issue than this person did. And in the process of actually talking to her, I realized that I didn't know anything about the issue because there was all these intelligent arguments on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, that I'd never really considered. And this is just a practical example of the same idea, where just because we have access to the framework which a social issue emerges out of, or an idea that is bouncing around society, like, just because we can see the problem doesn't mean we have any idea what the real solutions to that problem are, the arguments in favor or against the particular set of propositions. So yeah, it's just same idea, just presented through anecdote.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it takes a long time to understand something. And so I think that this is what this is saying. And what you see happening is that something new, there's like some new framework that comes up, and it's like emotions are driving the judgment. It's not, intellectual labor. And I've seen it time and again. And I'll also share an anecdote. It's not my own, but when I was in law school, um, I was taking, I think it was called comparative constitutional law. I think that's what the class was called. Or it was some constitutional theory type class. And the professor was talking about the Second Amendment. And he had said that he, like, wanted to prove a certain interpretation of the Second Amendment, which he leaned towards, which was that there could be, expansive regulation and so forth. But when he actually did the research, he came out on the other side, and it's not what he wanted to find. But yeah, so, like, looking at legal opinions, case law, etc., he came to the view that, yeah, his initial, like, what he wanted to find was not what he actually found. And so there's also that piece going on, and that also goes back. And I think this theme is going to come up again in this show, and this installment that came up last week, this whole idea about, as you put it, Randy, breaking frame and going beyond your framework. And the difficulty of doing that, and not everybody is going to, number one, open the book, number two, go through the intellectual labor, and number three, be open enough to change their sort of initial judgment, period.
I also cannot help but bring in Plato's Apology into this as well, when Socrates is standing trial and he is talking about the process when the oracle at Delphi declares that he is the wisest man, and he has this sort of cognitive dissonance and thinking it cannot possibly be me, for I know I am not wise, and that is the part in which makes me wise, is that I know I'm very ignorant and I have lots which to work towards. And so he goes around to all of these highfalutin individuals in ancient Greece, from the politicians, and questions them on like what makes, so these are supposedly the wise individuals and what makes them wise. And he comes to find, no, it is not from, based off emotion, flaunting these opinions and judgments without having done the hard intellectual work. And there seems to be a component where individuals in the masses then need to step forth and nurse their own ignorance, and for one, recognize it, which in and of itself is a process that involves pain, and you open yourself up to the possibility that you're fallible, which is a huge revolution of thought for individuals in a way. And I think Tilling perfectly encapsulates that in his phrase.
Cool. Yeah, so Riley, anything else on 69 or these thoughts here?
I mean, there's a lot to say. We could keep going on this for a long time, but I think we've said everything that we should say for now.
Okay. All right. So that's in chapter 4, this, this discussion about Darwin, and Martha's the only one who's actually read the book, and Tilling confesses that he hasn't, and then he makes these claims about what really needs to be done for an idea to take hold. And we're sort of moving into chapter 5, but basically, what I see going on in these chapters, and it's in the little description that was read earlier, progress of my friendship for Tilling. So there's something progressing, there's something evolving, and like her initial judgment of him is starting to break, because when she first meets him, she says there's no way, and she meets him at a ball and everybody's a potential suitor, and he comes up to her and she's like, no way, because you're a soldier. Okay. But what's happening is his character is coming out. She's realizing that he's different, and there's an attraction starts to develop. And the attraction is related to this conversation about Darwin, I think, very much so. And I think actually later on in the book, that moment is identified as the moment in which they fall in love. But chapter 4 ends with a letter that Freidrich von Tilling writes at the deathbed of his mother. And I'll turn it over to you, Riley, to continue talking about that and read a passage from that section.
Thank you. Yeah, so up to this point, before Martha gets the letter, she's kind of realizing that her feelings for Tilling are developing to something more romantic, beyond just a friendship. And it's something, she's kind of at odds with herself about, because she thinks that he may not feel that way about her because of a rumor she heard about him and some princess. But when she receives this letter from Tilling, it's another moment where she realizes, like, oh no, he loves me, because you wouldn't write this letter to someone that you don't feel this way about, even if he doesn't realize it himself. Because he is at the deathbed of his mother, and he is so distraught by her passing, because they were very close, that he just needs to put his feelings out somewhere and, have that kind of connection with someone. And so he, goes to his mother, goes to writing, goes to his mother, goes to writing, just back and forth until she passes. And at the beginning of his letter, from the beginning of his visit, he writes, he says, "You will get well again, mother," I cried. No, no, there is nothing to say about that, my dear boy. Do not profane our last time together with the usual sickbed consolations. Let us bid each other goodbye. And that's on page 82. So I really love what his mother says here, that the sort of consolations, like, oh, you're gonna get better again. She says that will profane their last time together. And they need to like actually say goodbye. I think that's something that's really profound and beautiful, because so often in these types of situations, there's all these silly consolations when you could actually be talking and saying goodbye. And this, I think, harkens back to of like where Tilling gets his sincerity from her, because earlier in the book, when he explains to Martha how Dotzky died, he says, you know, he won't tell her that he died a hero's death because he doesn't know what that means. You know, he's not going to give empty consolations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this sentence that you just read and the earlier part about how Tilling describes Dotzky's death, it's like truth hurts. And it's like facts are brutal. There are brutal facts, and face them. And so, yeah, like his mother is saying that, and that's also like very much the whole theme and framework of Lay Down Your Arms, because it's like until this book was written, the framework was ignoring those brutal facts about what it does to families, right? And it's just like this glory and honor thing. And so there's this recognition that there are tough facts that we have to face about war and about life. And yeah, as you all know, I call that being sober. Period. I'm done.
There's a lot in the letter that he writes that is worth, going into, and for anyone listening, it's worth reading the whole thing. But the letter that he's writing to her, it's acknowledging so much about the value of death and what it is. It's all behind the text, though. This idea that grief is bringing out an important moment, and that death is, it's like, it's towards the very end, where it's like the coldness of the universe. I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but I know that it's like he's got this idea in there that's it's pulling out the deepest parts of us and encouraging us to share them with each other. And there's something in there that's really special to me. And I know, like, death has been by far the greatest teacher in my life. And I think that's true for everybody. And so you can start to see like that set of emotions. It's all packaged in to this particular letter. It's like death is what drives him to reach out to the person he loves. Death is what connects him with the most important things. Like, I could say more, but that's really what I wanted to communicate.
Yeah, I think I'll read the sentence that I think you're referring to. So this is on page 83. But by how much the colder, the more unfeeling the universe seems to our pain, by so much the more longingly do we fly back to another human heart, which we believe is beating in unison with our feelings. Is that ish?
Yeah. It's that line, and then the context of it too. But yeah, that's definitely the line that I'm referring to.
Mm.
It's like there's something about this universe that like it doesn't pity us. It's like it slams us hard, and that push, that nudge gets us to where in fact we need to be going. Something like that.
Right. So the motive power of brutal facts or something like that.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, it's those kinds of, it's that motive power, right? It's that set of forces that's strong enough to force us to break frame. Just to come back to the original, the same, I'll just be toot my own horn on the same issue here. Like this, it's hard for people to change their minds about things. It's hard for people to get over preconceived ideas. And, Tilling, he probably believes that this woman doesn't care about him because she kind of was standoffish, but, he had to get over that, and it took death to do it. Yeah, and that's a pretty significant push. And, if she didn't feel the same way, how ridiculous would that letter seem, right? But because it's like death is powerful enough to push through a doubt like that, which, I mean, I think that's the message to take away.
Definitely. There was something else to another connection here. Back earlier, something we had talked about in the last episode was the scene where Martha tries to go visit an old woman who has lost her son in the war. And she says something about it's the duty of compassion to go weep with her. And yeah, there's something to Randy, like you said, how ridiculous would this letter have seemed if she didn't feel the same way about him? And, clearly she does, and she's very moved by this. And there's a line after she reads this letter where she says something about there is a line of sympathy between their two hearts. And I don't know, I think that's a beautiful thing. And she also sends a wreath of white flowers for his mother passing, and she includes one red rose in it that she means to be a gesture of, like, she's received his letter, she feels the same way, and like the red rose is for him. Yeah, that's all I had to add to that.
Anybody else on this death? Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I would just add, I would completely agree. This was also a part of the book that had greatly resonated with me because from lived experience, I can attest that it is very much the case that the universe is brutal. And I will second Randy in saying that, yeah, certainly a tragic death of a close individual in your life represents one of the most crushing forces to ever enter your life, but through certain framing and support and finding, the ability to overcome within yourself, it can be an immense propellant, and you gain so much intellectually from that fact. And I think from the loss of Martha's husband, and then she undergoes this process of, seeking out knowledge and like, I have a lot to learn, that it is really, and it's a phrase we've used before in the show, there's no coming to consciousness without pain. And having that experience is certainly something that propels your mind in a way to a higher state of being. Not for all individuals, though. I mean, I think most individuals most likely have the capability to do so, but when bad things happen to them, they have a high pain tolerance and there's no need to change. But in my personal experience, it has certainly been something that I've used to better myself as an individual and sort of, for one, come to reconcile yourself with the harsh brutality of the universe itself, which in a way is beautiful in my own personal opinion, and the way in which it gets you to rethink your preconceived notions of what was going to be out before you in life. And that process then increases mental dexterity, but then also increases your own personal fortitude and ability to spread that to others who then also may be in similar circumstances as you, that you are not alone in that sense. And but no, I thought it was a really beautiful part of the book itself.
Yes, and even though, like Frederick is taking a chance here and writing this letter, and then Martha sends him the red rose and so forth in chapter 5, one of the subheadings is doubts and fears. And still there's a sort of ambiguity to the nature of their bond. And Martha runs into him, and there's a sort of like aloofness that both of them are feeling from each other. One is, it's like they're waiting for someone to just make these declarations of love. And so that's what this doubts and fears piece, and I'm not going to read passages from this section, but it's like she has these expectations that he's going to come over and make these declarations, and he doesn't. And so she starts thinking, oh, he's with the princess and all of this. And so again, it's like this sort of like theme of the book about coming to see the truth and the sort of foolishness that one can walk around with and distort reality through not investigating, and then through one's own sort of childish insecurities. But he comes and visits her, and he announces that he's leaving Vienna, and he's out of there, and a conversation begins. And I'll turn it over to Riley to talk about some passages from that conversation.
Thanks. So in this conversation, one of the, I believe it's Martha's father, General Althaus, who says, if there's says something about hoping for another war to happen, and assumes that Tilling also hopes for this because he's a soldier, and that may, he could move up the ranks, so to speak. And Tilling seems kind of like offended at that, and he quickly corrects and says no, he doesn't hope for that. And he continues to say on page 97, I am quite aware that the opportunity for personal distinction comes to the soldier only from campaigns, but how poor of heart and narrow of mind must a man be before his selfish interests can seem to him so gigantic as to blot out the sight of the universal misery? Peace is, as you said yourself, the only condition in which the interests of the population can be furthered, and yet you would give to a large fragment of this population, the army, the right to wish for the cessation of the condition of growth, and to long for that of destruction? To make war that the army may anyhow be occupied and satisfied is just as if we set fire to houses, that the fire brigade may distinguish itself and earn renown. And I find that metaphor to be really important, because it makes it, it brings to light how ridiculous it is to be to have the kind of feelings, to hope that war will happen so soldiers can distinguish themselves. And, maybe to our ears that already is ridiculous, but, considering the framework that these people are in, most of them, like, it doesn't seem that ridiculous. And one of them even says something about how that metaphor doesn't work, it's not right, or, it's ridiculous to even make a metaphor like that because it's not the same, even though clearly it is the same. Does anyone have anything to add to this quote?
I mean, I can echo the sentiment. Like, it's definitely highlighting one of the ridiculous frames of reference to adopt when we're thinking about war. And if honor and valor and glory are the only things that we're associating with war, we're missing something, because it leads to an absurd place, which is what the metaphor identifies. It's like, if it's all about glory, then we should start finding really other absurd ways to find glory and destruction of property for the fire engines would be would be one method, I suppose. Personally, I don't know if this is one of the real arguments, though. It's just, I think this is an example of the kind of thing going on in the previous chapter where there's like a question about Darwin, right? And it's like, I think that this is an argument about war for people who haven't really read the book, so to speak. Because like, I think that there's a lot more important situations associated with the causes of conflict that end up sometimes making their way all the way up to large scale war. But yeah, like the opinion associated with doing like wishing for war for accolades is just, I mean, it's being portrayed as naive because it's naive. So I don't know. I just want to draw a connection to the fact that, there's a theme in this book tying together the fact that people are not really addressing the real situation at all. And this is just a more explicit evisceration of a poor argument in favor of this kind of conflict.
Right. And, like this particular quote, like, I guess there's not a whole lot to add to it because, like you said, it's just kind of echoing some of the themes that are throughout this whole book. And I don't know, it seems pretty clear. I guess it's kind of difficult to disagree with it. But this conversation continues, and like, some of the people are disagreeing with him and thinking what he's saying is, kind of like crazy talk. And he continues to say things that even though he's a soldier and he, will continue out his duty given the case of a war, like he wishes that there weren't wars. And so Martha's dad says something about how, well, we can't really get rid of war. That would be like trying to get rid of misery. Like it just can't happen. War is a given. And Tilling kind of responds to this, saying that, Martha's dad has just allowed himself to be resigned to it. It's kind of the view of the age is resignation in the face of war. And on page 99, he says, "If ever, at the sight of a great evil, the doubtful question has forced itself on one's heart, must this be so? Then the heart can no longer remain cold. And, besides pity, a kind of repentance springs up. Not a personal repentance, indeed, but a protest from the conscience of the age." And so with this quote, it seems that most of the people haven't even thought to ask the question, must this be so, regarding war? In these circles here that Martha and Frederick are involved in, like, when you haven't asked that question yet, you can kind of bury your head in the sand, so to speak, and not look at the more difficult questions, not look at like the consequences of war. You can just focus on glory, like we've been talking about this whole time.
I think that the fact that this is coming so quickly after this conversation about the book of Darwin is I think it's non-accidental, because basically the frame of reference that is being encouraged now to think about like a different way to consider war, like to imagine war from a more humane place, that frame actually was, we can make an argument at least that frame of reference was not possible until the time of the writing of this book. Like when Lay Down Your Arms is published, there's this emerging international community that simply did not exist for most of human history, until the book, right? And there was conversations happening between nations, but the framework for arbitration as a solution to conflict as opposed to war was something that needed to be built, and it was beginning to be built. And there was little pieces here or there, like we've talked about on this show. We've talked about the first Geneva Conventions and what those are about, and that's a monumental moment very recently in in the consciousness of the person writing. And it's like, maybe the evolution of consciousness has made it to a point where we can at least begin to look at war differently. Because it's not like we have to think the same way about something forever. It's not like the way we think about, cars today is the same way it's going to be in 100 years. Like we're going to have different attitudes about things as things change. And war is something that maybe it's time to think differently about. And that's, I think, the premise of the book, but this section you're referring to in particular.
And I'll just add to that apart from the origin of species and the evolution of consciousness, this, what this book does is throw into people's face the brutal fact that this has an effect on families. And during the Civil War, and really, conscientious objection has been around since, the dawn of Christianity. And we know here that Socrates says never return harm for harm, yet he does serve admirably in the army. But there are these ideas that are being thrown around hundreds of years earlier. But really with the Civil War, and I don't know enough about how women reacted to wars in other countries. So I can just talk about the Civil War in the United States, that, the women were sort of asked, they were concerned about where their husbands and brothers and fathers were. And there really wasn't a system in place to even, account for that. So it's like, that just shows that that's just not an important consideration at first. And I think there you begin this evolution of consciousness, that it's not just about the people who are fighting, it's also like these people who are left behind and depend on them. And that I just want to, add that to the evolution of consciousness piece that you're talking about, Randy, that it's also this acknowledgement that this unit, the family unit, is seriously damaged by this institution. And as we've discussed, and again, I draw attention to that little article, How I Wrote Lay Down Your Arms. Again, the show resources page from last week. It's really great. Bertha learns about this arbitration movement when in midlife. She had no idea that there was this project going on. So yeah, this is something that's evolving, and it's still evolving during our lifetimes. It's still being built. And this importance of the family is a piece of it, and also the importance of the individual, the dignity of the individual is another piece of it. So I'll stop.
Yeah, so there's a bit about patriotism that happens right after what Riley was quoting, and I think that it ties into the point you're making here, but it takes a second for me to build it. You know, we have to identify like our community. Like, we are social creatures. That's not negotiable. And so one of the markers of a social being has to do with the customs that you follow, the language you speak, blah, 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 right? There's a long list. And there is something important and good about the part of us that's willing to stand up and defend that at all costs, right? The problem is that that part of us hasn't found a new way. It hasn't mapped on to group sizes that are hundreds of thousands or millions, because that system is built to be very, very functional and necessary for a small community. But it doesn't make any sense when we're talking about like a billion people wide community, right? Like, there's too much distance between the valor and whatever else that goes along with self-sacrifice for the greater good, when your network is like not just your town or your village, right? So like, this idea of patriotism is an attempt at creating a new identity whereby admiration and valor can map on to a nation state. But it starts to be a little weird, right? It doesn't seem to make much sense, because the old style had so much packaged into your willingness to do and inflict and suffer either pain or death. And yeah, like, that doesn't seem to weigh up on the scales anymore, because like, if we imagine, we're in a small village and my son and my father are both going off to do something that's protecting the village from like a bunch of predators or predatory people, that's clearly protecting the family, right? So protecting the family, high priority idea packaged into valor and honor. Unfortunately, the same danger isn't obviously connected anymore. So that disconnect starts to become visible in our modern world, and therefore the concept of patriotism gets a little confusing.
Is that a period?
It's like, I gotta stop it somewhere, this train can go right off the rails and just it'll end up in the swamp.
Right. So you're talking about sort of shifting notions of community and belonging, it sounds like, and notions of patriotism mapping onto new notions of community and belonging. Am I hearing you correctly?
Right. I'm trying to give credit where credit is due and say admiration and valor for the willingness to participate in conflict that very likely could involve pain and death has a function. It's good. But we live in a time when that frame does not seem to map on as cleanly as it used to. There's a lot of things in the world are different now, and maybe this is one of them.
Yeah, and elsewhere, like Bertha, like is not. She's not a complete pacifist. She does believe in using force to defend like one's self and others. However, this sort of like aggressive land grabs and this kind of thing, wars of aggression and wars over boundaries, I think that goes into chapter 6, which I don't think we'll get to today. She's not so much urging or sanctioning force in those areas, but there's I think it's in her memoirs where she clearly says something like, if you see, it's almost like humanitarian intervention. If you see somebody else being harmed, yeah, you have a duty to stop the person doing the harm. And so that's, a conversation for another day. But yeah, clearly her father's view is like, this is the way to get glory for the country and for men to distinguish themselves. And this is the only way to do it. And it really doesn't, and like everything else is trumped by these values that you're getting from this kind of activity. And definitely Frederick is disagreeing with that view. He's a younger man. We've talked about this. And so I'll stop and I'll turn it back over to Riley, who I think has one more quote to talk about in chapter 5.
Yes. And also, Randy, like, I don't have anything to add to what you said, but I completely agree with you, and I think an important point to make, so thank you. So yeah, after this conversation that they have, we just talked about, and everyone leaves, Martha and her father are kind of sitting together, and her father, General Althaus, is kind of like, almost like he's kind of ranting and raving about Tilling and how wrong he is and how like he can't believe that he said these things, and he just completely disagrees with Tilling. And we mentioned last time about how Martha's father in this story kind of represents the old way of looking at things, and the old idea that valor, what have you, is like the only way to like have important or good value distinction. And Martha says about this on page 105, that my father considered the views expressed yesterday as so completely false depended merely on a total failure to understand them. My father was utterly blind to the point of view which Tilling had reached. I could not make him see. I could not teach him to apply a different ethical standard than the military, which indeed was, in General Althaus's eyes, the highest standard, to the thoughts which Tilling cherished as a man and as a philosopher. And this harkens back to earlier in the book when Martha had read Thomas Buckle's History of Civilization and said how she, felt like she had climbed to the top of a mountain for the first time and seen everything below it. Talk about these things with her father because he wouldn't climb up the mountain. And this is, as we've been talking about this whole time, breaking frame. You can't break someone's frame for them, or at least they'll be very resistant to it. And I just think, there's this kind of resignation here, but also not acceptance. So she kind of just accepts that she kind of accepts that she can't make her father see this way, even though she's still like not going to abide how he thinks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, at some point she's just acknowledging that, like, you can't necessarily change people's minds, and some people are, the more you push, the more they dig their heels in the sand. And this is a military person speaking, or she's speaking about, so they're trained to stand their ground quite firmly. So yeah, I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, that's basically it.
Well, and just to, I think I said this last week, I'll say it again. I really like the phrase, people don't like getting poked in the axioms. I really like that phrase.
It's good.
It's like it gets to the heart of it, though. And for some people, it's easier to cut ties with people than it is to change their own minds, because changing their mind would require them to cut ties with themselves, and a lot of the time people are not at all interested in doing that. It's a personal death, right? A part of them would die. And maybe it's the most important part of them in their own mind. Now, we could argue one way or the other about whether that's a mistake, but at the end of the day, you know, whatever people's identities are baked into are the things that they're willing to defend. And some people are willing to defend things to the death. So, you know, that's what she's bumping into in her father, and recognizing the futility of that. It's like, oh, I'm pushing it up against something that someone is willing to die to defend. Maybe it's better to just let it go for now. It's like, I don't know. It's acceptance rather than resignation in my view, but yeah.
And yeah, although it's in chapter 6, and although I don't think we should go into chapter 6, I just want to throw it out there for now and plant the seed for when we come back and do a deeper dive into chapter 6. But her father kind of changes. so there's something going on with her father, and I'll just plant the seed now, and we can think about it and then come back and talk about it more. But he, I know, at first is not very accepting of this relationship between Martha and Frederick, but that softens over time. I'll just leave it there. But yeah, we talked about just like doing up to chapter 5, and I just, before I read this quote on page 110, which will be my summary, and then we'll just go around and, as we always do, and like final thoughts. Before I do that, I just want to see if Michael, you have anything to add to all of this before I start reading this quote from page 110.
Yeah, sure. What I appreciated, Hope, was the whole not wanting, General Althaus to be the one that is then vilified in the show, but then before getting more context of him in chapter 6. But on page 105, the line that had stuck out to me when I read it was, that has already been said, that my father considered the views expressed yesterday as so completely false, depended merely on a total failure to understand them. And after he hears Tiller's, like, his position, he says, the first line after that is, he says, that is above me. That is, there's this recognition on his part that there exists this perspective in view, which he seems to recognize as maybe a morally higher standpoint, maybe not achieving the same valor where this good for him is pointed towards, that is the ultimate thing. But there seems in his mind a vague notion of this recognition of something above that. But in resigning himself to the circumstance that is above me, I will not be able to understand that. So I will then stick in this position that I know, and then continue to use this energy and pursue this sheer good and pleasure in war that I have always known, instead of, undergoing this process where you then realize, hey, maybe there is something to this perspective that I should be considering. And I will interject my favorite phrase. I think that process requires a revolution of thought, that it takes a lot to remove oneself from their entrenched axioms and to realign themselves maybe on a different path that has not been wrought yet. And yeah, then we can get into more of what that happens in chapter 6.
Yes, and I'll just repeat what I said last week, which I think the phrase that you use, people don't like to have their axioms poked. Yeah, that was, I think that's how you put it last week or 2 weeks, whenever it was. But, and I followed up with, as if people had axioms. That's not what I said, but, as if had axioms. And this just comes from my reading of Plato and my interpretation of what Socrates is doing. Like, a lot of people don't even have actual beliefs. They're just these sort of phantom propositional attitudes that shift with the wind, and they're not really that strong. And what's the glue that what people don't like getting poked is their sense of their need to belong. That's how I put it. So there's like this propositional, like when we talk about an axiom, we're talking about, a clear like commitment to a principle. My belief is not a lot of people have clear ones, and and many people it's more primitive, and it's this like, yeah, like you were saying before, like it's like identity and my belonging and my sort of need to belong is being satisfied through this sort of affective attitude, and you're challenging that. So enough of that, and I'll just, this chapter 5 goes up to page 115, and on page 110, and this will begin my summation. So I'll start with myself, and then we'll just we'll go in alphabetical order, starting from Michael, and then Randy, and then Riley will have the last word. So page 110, Martha says, "What had first attracted me was the way in which she had spoken of war. What I had thought and felt in silence, believing that no soldier could think any such thing, much less utter it, he had thought more clearly than I, felt it more strongly, and uttered it with perfect freedom. Then I saw how his heart towered above the interests of his profession and his intellect above the views of the period. It was that which, so to speak, laid the foundation of my devoted love for him." And I think there's so much going on with these first 5-6 chapters about appearance and reality. And like, again, when she first meets him, there's no way I could like this guy because he's a soldier. But actually, the thoughts that he's uttering are the kind of my intuitions, but he's doing it with like this clarity. And I see here, going back to Randy's point about community, there is a little community being formed between Martha and Frederick, on a term that I use often, a genuine encounter. There's some kind of like deep communication going on, deep belonging to this other viewpoint that's beyond his profession, beyond the age. And that is laying the foundation for her love for him. And what a contrast to her first marriage, which was more, she's like this, it's girlish days, and she's a thoroughly overwrought creature, and it's like a love at first sight type bond. Whereas after she goes through this pain of suffering his death and then reading, there's a different person here. And so there's a different way that she's going to relate to romance and love. And I'll end it there. And Michael, last thoughts.
One thing that, and I find it so important that this is a text that we are talking about and continue to put out there into the universe, is that it really marks, as we've been talking about, this moment where this continued progress of human consciousness, and that for centuries prior in Bertha's time when she's writing this, and it's talked about very much in the book, it's this war, it is death on the battlefield, is this glory, this nationalism is, and all those more intricate political notions that arise within the Industrial Revolution. And it's like, in this, you see the beginning of like human consciousness and, human reason clawing itself out of the Dark Ages. Like, this is the hand and the nails gripped into the soil of, the very fruitful meadow or something along those lines, where it's arising out of this place. And I think to mark where we are presently, January 22nd of this year, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force. So, since World War II, we have now these weapons with the possibility of wiping out all of humanity. Wait, everyone, we really can't engage in total war in a sense that we used to, because we will wipe out all of humanity. And then that does something for people. That is a revolution of thought in and of itself, where we have to really we cannot just be so haphazard with individuals' lives and national resources to pour into this. And one of the first lines of the treaty, and the one where it begins like the state parties to this treaty, and then it says, acknowledging the ethical imperatives of nuclear disarmament and the urgency of achieving and maintaining a nuclear weapon-free world, which is a global public good of the highest order, serving both national and collective security interests. For me, this line had come to mind when we were discussing this show, because we've been talking about individuals within this text who view highest pleasure and valor to be pointed towards conflict. But then in 2021, to kind of mark where we've come from that point, we have an international treaty that it is the highest order of good to disarm from these weapons that would wipe out humanity, to disarm from this process of mutually assured destruction, and helping to go forward and build a world where you're not on the brink of total human annihilation. And I found that to be an interesting parallel of where sort of the evolution of human consciousness has gone in our present time. And then even digging through the treaty, and if you just look around the world as a whole, there's still a lot of work to be done. But that is the nature of progress. And I'll end with upward.
So I know that what I want to end up saying, it's gonna require too much to say properly, but I know that the sentiment behind the way I felt about this particular set of chapters, it's this marking this big leap in emotional maturity. It's recognizing a higher vantage point and looking at things in a way that's it's a big step, and it's the first step along which I think most people get stuck. I don't know if this is true, right? I'm speculating, but to take the leap beyond the way everybody else thinks and feels it's like the first step along the path of individuation that, I don't know, it seems like there's a tremendous pressure for people to not take. So the fact that Martha's willing to, and it's started, it's showing up in this chapter, or these two chapters. That's pretty cool to me. And there's a long way to go for her and for humanity. I think at the end of the day, Michael's point about our capacity for ultimate annihilation is a pretty good justification for why certain things need to change about the way we view the world. And yeah, I see this text as demonstrating some of the key steps along the way. We get to kind of walk through it with Martha, and it's pretty cool. That's all.
So what I wanted to finish up with is quite a bit of a lighter note, so I hope it doesn't take away from the gravity of what you all have said, because all of it's super important. Michael, thank you for sharing about the treaty, because I think that that's something that needs to be brought in front of us much more often. But I just wanted to add kind of what happens in this chapter between Martha and Tilling, just to give more context about what's going on with their relationship. So near the end of the chapter, they go on this like horseback ride together, basically, and have a conversation about, their, like, the titles of this chapter, doubts and fears. They talk about the doubts and fears they had, why they thought maybe the other one didn't like them so much, or what have you. And Frederick says he had heard a rumor that one of the Althouse's cousins was courting one of General Althouse's daughters, and asks her if it's true, and she says yes, that's true. And he's kind of like sad at first, but she's like, it's my sister, not me. And so they are able to dispel the fears they had that each was involved with someone else, and this brings them close together. And at the end of the chapter, they are engaged, and she goes to tell her aunt and her father, who at first are very upset, but as we'll see, like Hope said, you know, their views about Freidrich Tilling soften. But yeah, that's all I'll say.
Okay, well, I think that's a wrap for today. So again, we're stopping at page 115. So that is the end of chapter 5. So when we come back, we'll begin with chapter 6 and do chapter 6 and maybe 1 or 2 other chapters. Do check out our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. Thank you, Michael, Randy, and Riley, for continuing this important conversation about Bertha von Suttner's Lay Down Your Arms. Have a good evening and goodbye.